Welcome to Real Estate Raw. Thanks for joining me. As always, we're going to have Monica Wyndham join us. Monica is the CEO of Rand Property Management Solutions. So reach out to her if you're looking for someone to help you build your property management company. And I myself have been in real estate for about 20 years now. Monica's been in for a long time, I think about 10. And so I've been teaching for a long time. As a review of last week we talked about looking at the multifamily underwriting process, right? What is underwriting? The formulas for underwriting, kind of give you a review. Started off with the basic formula: income minus expenses equals NOI, right? Net operating income minus debt service equals cash flow, right? Cash flow divided by the total acquisition cost gives us cash on cash, right? And so we kind of learned about debt service ratio, the different things of that nature, looking at about a 1.25 if you're trying to use traditional finance, looking to place the number and the purchase price based on the income, the expenses, things of that nature that we find on the T12. So as a reminder, I've got a class coming up May 18th, 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be doing a free webinar on underwriting. So certainly sign up for that. We'll put the link in here. Also going to be doing a two-part series. So this week is going to be part number 1. Next week will be part number 2. This session this week is going to be on rent rolls, how to read a rent roll. Last week, we kind of did general underwriting. Next week, I'm going to show you how to read a T12. I've decided to break this up into 2 different segments, reading the rent roll and reading the T12, because if I do both in one session, it'll probably be a long session, or I'm going to wind up sort of glazing over certain things that I probably should spend some time on. So today we're going to just do the rent roll. Next week, we'll do T12. And then on the 18th, we have the free webinar, 7 p.m. Eastern. So make sure you sign up for that as well. All right, so getting started, looking at a rent roll. All right, so we're kind of going along the process. We're going to assume we've gotten this full package of data from a realtor, seller, something like that. We've looked at the OM, the offering memorandum. We've gone through that. We've looked at the pictures, the charts, the graphs. Fine. We've now pulled out our rent roll. This is the second part of analyzing a deal. All right. So part 1 is read the OM. Part 2 would be read and understand your rent roll. Part 3 would be read and understand the T12. We'll do that next week. And then only then would you pull out a template and start entering in data and doing things of that nature, right? So this is what I'm doing. All the stuff I'm teaching you right now is leading up to you actually using a template, because as my students know, and the people that I've worked with know, there's no point in analyzing a bad deal. I don't like analyzing deals, and I like to kill deals. So I don't want to sit here and just crunch numbers on something that clearly isn't going to work. So I figured out ways to kill deals and kill them quick. If things no good, don't we want to know it early on, right? Rather get to a no as soon as possible than hang out in maybe world for all afternoon analyzing something. All right, so we've gotten this far. We've now opened up our rent roll. All right, for those who are new, maybe new to multifamily, don't know, rent roll is what we have here on the screen. And it's sort of your tenant ledger, right? Shows all the move in, move out dates and rents and deposits, things of that nature, or at least it should. Not all rent rolls come with all the data that we would like to see. Rent rolls, like a profit and loss, like a T12, are like fingerprints and snowflakes, right? There are no two that are the same. So you have to learn how to read all of them so that every time you get a different format, you get different data. They've given you the right data, they're missing data, generally what you're looking for, and then you can go back and ask the realtor or the seller for missing information. So that's what we're going to do here. The first thing I do when I open a rent roll, I'm looking for the tenant balance column. All right, and we would see that right here in column AN in this particular rent roll here. All right, tenant balance. First off, it's exactly what it sounds like. The tenants owe money. You have to understand that the tenant balance column is a debit column by nature, right? That means that negatives are positive, positives are negative. So if a tenant has a positive balance, like we see tenant number 1 here has a positive balance of $921.98, that means they owe us $921.98 in back rent. If they have a negative number in here, that means it is prepaid rent, right? That means we actually owe them rent. So that's good. They've paid into the future. All right. So the very first thing I do is I open it up to see, does the tenant balance column exist? Now, you'd be surprised. I'm going to tell you that maybe 40-50% of the rent rolls you're going to get out here in the world will not have this data. Why not? Don't know. just, either they've deleted it, they've omitted it, they don't want you to see it. I don't know, but you will find that a lot of rent rolls don't have that data. I find that to be suspicious. We need the information. So step one is the column here. If you do not find this data, you now know that you have to go and talk to the realtor or the seller and ask for an accounts receivable report. Right. And that's a report that will tell you what's owed, who's owed, what money is coming in, that kind of thing. Right. And if the seller owes money to someone else. So accounts receivable report if you don't have the tenant balance column. Okay, we do have the tenant balance column. Great. Let's move forward. What I'm looking for now is to see how many tenants have a 2x balance or greater. Right. So what I'm looking at here, I think I can move it. So we see the balance here. So the rent. So you're going to come over here and you're going to look at the rent. So right here, $925.99. What I want to see is how many tenants over here have a 2x balance, right? How many tenants owe 2 months or more? It's been my experience, and Monica as well, I'm sure she can attest to this, that once a tenant hits about a 60-day delinquency, they tend not to catch up. When you get a tenant out 60 days or more in back rent, sometimes you can work it out with them, but almost always it's going to be a vacancy or an eviction, something like that, or they're just going to skip out and you're going to have bad debt write-off. So anybody with 2x balance, what we are going to do while looking at this rent roll and while analyzing this deal is to now count that as a vacancy, right? So let's talk about the difference between economic vacancy and physical vacancy. All right, someone is living in a unit. That means the unit is physically occupied. If you have all units, rented out, that means you are at 100% physical occupancy. But that does not mean that you are at 100% economic occupancy, right? If a tenant is living in there and not paying the rent, it's physically occupied, economically vacant. And a tenant living in a unit, an economically vacant unit, is worse than a physically vacant unit, because that means that tenant is still in there. They're still consuming the utilities, the products, maybe damaging the unit. And you might have to go through the process of actually, getting them out. What we call the dispossessory process. There's your term for today. Most people don't know that word, dispossessory. So there you go. You're gonna have to take them through the eviction process. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna scan along and we're saying how many tenants have that 2x balance, and we're gonna add that to all current vacancies. So we're looking over the column over here. You come along, here's a tenant, kind of slow paying a little bit. It's all right, we're scrolling down. Yep, here we go. All right, see here. This tenant's total charge is $950, but they have a positive balance of $2,335. That's more than 2 months rent, right? So I'm going to now take this and say, well, that is a vacancy. So that's one. I don't think we had any other physical vacancies. I don't see any. No, so all these units are leased. So if some of these units were physically vacant, I would be adding that, and we'd say 2 or 3 now, right? So coming on down. Now here's a tenant who has prepaid. Looks like they've prepaid about 2 months in advance, really. So you're doing good here. That's good. Here's another slightly slow paying tenant. And then here's another tenant with almost a 3-month balance. So we see here that we have 2 tenants total that we know are probably going to be evictions in the future. So as far as our analysis is concerned, those are vacant. Add them to all other vacancies for a total aggregate of physical and economic. I'm really going to almost treat these things the same right now, right? Now, keep in mind, sidebar here, economic vacancy can have other things to do with besides tenants not paying the rent. What if you are giving away free rent? 1 month free to move in, or some form of concession. That is an economic vacancy. The more rent, the more things you have to give away, less money you make, economic vacancy, right? So those are other ways that you can have that sort of economic vacancy in a unit. All right, so we're adding that up. That's what we're doing here. Should only take you a couple seconds. The total down here, owed, total balance column, is relatively irrelevant. Don't worry about this number here, because think about it. It's the addition of money owed plus money paid forward. So this is saying you have a balance owed of $4,000, but we know that's not true because you got $3,000 right here, and another $2,000 right here, and another $1,000 right here. It's clearly more than $4,000. That's because you're adding in the negative. So don't worry about the total balance. I'm only really worried about the folks that are owed money and owe more than 2 months. All right. So that's what I do in there, tenant balance column. Okay. Next thing that I do is I jump over here and look and see what we have going on as far as column headers. So we got move in, lease start, lease end, move out. That's good. Not all rent rolls will have all that. Sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. You never know. All right. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at the lease end column here, right? So we're looking at that to see what we call lease exposure. All right. So it's another term you need to know, lease exposure. And that is a collection of tenants or an abnormal amount of tenants that may have their leases come due in any one particular month, right? Called lease exposure. It's not great for us as operators to have a whole bunch of tenants come due in 1 month. It's not the end of the world, but it's not great. The lender won't like it. That's who's going to give you a hard time about a lot of lease exposure. I have never had a whole pile of tenants just up and move off the property altogether all at once, collapse the occupancy because their lease came due. Now, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying I've never seen it. I'm pretty sure Monica's never seen that either, unless there was something physically made everybody leave. It's not common. So I would not say lease exposure is a tremendous deal breaker if you see that. And in some cases, if a lot of these tenants are either coming due or, by the way, if their leases have already come due, then their tenancy at will month to month, that is lease exposure. Yeah, but it also gives you the ability to renew leases and possibly grow rent quickly. So there's a good and a bad. The property that I actually first met Monica on when I very first hired Monica in Warner Robins, Georgia, the manager that I had before Monica was an interesting employee, and she wound up leasing up an apartment complex. I bought this place and it was like 60% occupancy. And before I figured it out, the manager was in there just renewing every single tenant in the property to the exact same calendar month, 12 months out. So she was just steadily renewing and creating new leases and making every lease come due in like December of 21 or whatever that year was, 19, something like that, So she was just mechanically causing tremendous amounts of lease exposure before I realized what she was doing and caught it and stopped it. So that is some other ways that you might see some odd lease exposure that's a normal occurrence. But besides lease exposure, the next thing I'm worried about is the pattern of a person, human pattern, right? So what I'm looking for here is any kind of outlier pattern that would tell me something's up, that I need to get more information, or that maybe something is going on here. All right, what I mean is that the national average for tenancy is about 2 years. Tenants live in apartments on average 2 years. Therefore, you have about 50% turnover a year. All right. So if the tenants turn over 50% a year and it's throughout the year, shouldn't the lease ends all be sort of random throughout the year? Yeah, I would say they are. And if all of a sudden you see a bulk of tenants that all come due in one sort of month, that's an outlier pattern. That's strange. Why do we have all these tenants come due? Shouldn't they be coming due throughout the year? So that's what I'm really looking for. Yeah, there's this whole thing about lease exposure. It's good to know that, but that's not really why I'm here. I'm looking at this going, all right, are there a bunch of tenants coming due? That would be strange, And so what you do is you just scan this column here, and you're looking along at these dates to see, is there 1 month that has a high frequency? And this is a smaller property, so I've seen a few in May, but nothing crazy, right? If you see this, if you see a big bunch of tenants that are all kind of coming due at 1 month, then you want to look over here at the move-in column, right? And say, okay, did all of these tenants move in bulk? That would be suspicious. All right. In my 20 years experience, I have only found 2 reasons that you have a big pile of tenants all move in at one time in short order. And it's either that it was a renovation, they went in, they renovated the property, and they're now leasing up, grand opening, they're moving everybody in. Fine. That's a good reason. The other answer is it is what I call a straw man lease up. It is fraudulent leasing. That property typically doesn't operate well, typically has low occupancy. The seller knows this isn't good. Maybe the realtor got a hold of them and said, hey, listen, you're going to need to lease this thing up. What's the realtor and the management company do? They just open the door and let anybody in that can fog a mirror, flood the property full of tenants, show the rent roll, bada bing, it's leased up, yay, great, sell the property to you. About 90 days later, the occupancy absolutely collapses. How do I know? Because I've had somebody do it to me. And after it happened, I went back and read through the rent roll and went, there was a pattern here. We could have caught this. We could have seen this. This would have tipped me off to maybe look at the lease audit when I go to do due diligence. I go through that lease audit a little better. So what I'm looking for now is there any big bulk of tenants moving in? We will not have an answer. You will not know if you find a bunch of people moving in why it has occurred. You will only be able to say, that's a good question to ask, right? And I've said this before, when we're analyzing deals, we're not trying to arrive at the right answer. You're trying to arrive at the right questions to ask. And if you got a bunch of tenants moving in all together, that's a damn good question to ask. Go ask the realtor, go ask the seller, whomever, hey, why are all these people moving in? So that's what I'm looking for there, right? It would be suspicious and possibly fraudulent leasing. All right. Now, just to kind of run through what we're looking at here, notice you do have move in, lease start, lease end. So notice that lease start is not always the same as move in, right? These people moved in several years ago, but their lease started in 22. Yeah, they've been renewing leases. So you can see they've moved in and they've renewed a lease for 12 months and it ends here. So that's good, right? And that takes me to my last point on move-ins and lease-ins. I want to kind of look at the move-in column and scroll down, looking at the years and just kind of gauging what's the turnover here. Right now, this rent roll is a little old. We can come up here and see that it was 2023 or March 2023. It's a little bit older, but I would be looking along. If you're seeing every year in here, 21, 22, 22, 22, 21, maybe 22, your turnover is higher than 50%. And I'm just kind of quickly looking at that. But that's something I would gauge to say, man, we got a lot of tenants moving in and out. If so, could be bad management, could be a bad neighborhood. Don't know. So we're seeing some 18 here, 19. That's good. People have been living in here for a little while. 19. I would say this is pretty normal turnover. So no red flags here. But that's what I'm looking at. Just quickly scanning through there. Tenants in and out, turning over. Do we see anything crazy like that? All right. Lastly, I'm going to kind of just glance over here and say, what are the rents that we're actually collecting? And what do they say the market rent is? All right. Keep in mind, that is what we call loss to lease. Okay. So if you have market rent, buyer beware, the seller is making that number up, market rent, and the difference between market rent and effective rent, right? Those are terms you need to know. Effective rent, what is actually on the lease? And the difference between the two is loss to lease. Well, it's loss to lease if market rent is higher than actual effective rent, right? If effective rent is technically higher than market rent, you have what we call gain to lease, and that's bad. That means your rent is actually probably per the market projected to decline. So that's what I'm looking for there. That's about the only other thing I do. So tenant balance, is it there? Yes, no. Do we have, how many tenants are 2x the rent? Okay, we're going to make sure we kick them out and then come along, move in, move out. Do we see anything weird in leasing patterns? Yes, no. Look at your total amount, versus market rent. Do we agree with market rent? Do we think this is real? Do we think these people are crazy? Can we really get the rent up here? We don't know. Those are all kind of questions you want to be asking yourself as you're looking at this. A lot of times you'll have totals down here, depending on how well the rent roll is put together, if it is created from software. You can see your just total different things here. Other things to look at, sometimes I don't see it here. You'll have different acronyms on here. You'll have things like NTV, which stands for notice to vacate. Right. So if you see NTV 1, 2, 3, that means that is a unit that someone has placed a notice to vacate. It is currently occupied, but the person has said, hey, we're moving out at certain time. Right. You have occupied. That is obviously someone's living in there, and you have vacant. That's clearly someone is not living in there. The rent roll goes further than this, and you'll see vacant pre-leased. Okay. Those mean that's kind of like the notice to vacate. It's occupied, but it's about to be vacant. Those are vacant, about to be occupied. Then you have just truly vacant, no pre-lease, and then occupied. Those are your 4 years old categories you see. And you can look at that. You get your square footage, everything else down here. So not much more than that on a rent roll. So that's what we're doing there. Just kind of scan through all that and make sure that, everything looks straight. Make sure that doesn't look like any strange leasing patterns, anything like that. Look through that, make sure your tenant rent roll is there. All that is good. Make sure all that's good. And then we're going to move on to the T12. So next week, we're going to be doing T12. I'll spend some time, really sit down, break out the T12. We're going to go through one of those, trailing 12, by the way. We're going to go through that line by line, really show you how to underwrite the deal. And that's going to be leading up to the masterclass that we're going to have, Monica and I are going to have on the 18th. I see she's posted that here, so I appreciate that, Monica. Again, if anybody needs any excellent property management consulting, reach out to her. All right, that's what I have for you today. I appreciate everybody stopping by, and we will see you next week.